Welcome to section 3 of my lecture series on experientialism. In this section, I'm going to cover a couple miscellaneous problems that any epistemology has to deal with. They're all somewhat related, but only very loosely. So I think it's better to do these in a collective section, but at the same time, none of them are individually detailed or difficult enough to require their own section. And at the same time, any section that contains them can't really be put under one particular heading because of how disparate they are. So the things I want to cover is, first of all, one of the things I want to cover is, first of all, the problem of other minds. And then tied in with that is the problem of hallucination, or distinguishing imagination from reality. And then on top of that, I want to deal with the problem of authority. And then in addition, I actually need to talk about in more detail why basically how we derive Bayesian reasoning and other epistemological strategies besides mere falsificationism and the scientific method, which I pretty much covered in the previous section from experientialism. Okay, so to start with the problem of other minds, we have this dilemma, right? We are looking at something that might have a subjective experience and might not. We don't have access to its subjective experience in the same immediate, indubitable way that we do our own subjective experience. And so that means that we can't be as sure of the existence of other subjective experiences as we can of our own subjective experiences. At the same time, however, it certainly looks like, based on external evidence, there are other beings with subjective experiences. But counterbalancing that, we have the problem that subjective experience is something that's complicated and nuanced, and it seems like it would require some sort of justification to assume it for certain things and not other things, and assume it at all, really, because of its complexity and sort of the ontological weight that it carries with it. So my solution to the problem of other minds is this. When we're functioning within the envelope, which we do know is external to us, we encounter these other beings, right? What appear to be other, things like ourselves, right? And things less like ourselves, like animals and so on. We know that they must be somehow part of the envelope, at least in the way we are, where we're connected to it and can affect it and can sense it, which, is being as a part of the envelope as anything really can be anyway. Because they affect us and they affect the envelope that we see, and they seem capable of knowing things about the envelope before we do. But then when we go and check, it's true of our version of the envelope, and we can be totally certain that we don't know those things until we've checked, and we don't know that they'll tell us those things until they tell us, which indicates that they are seeing the same world we do from a different position, right? But we don't know that all these seeming people might not be automatons. However, we do know that our own subjective experience influences us to act and interact in certain ways and present to the world and affect the world in certain ways, including the capacity for language, especially, right? And so we see that these other beings present in ways that are in all the important respects that are related to our subjective experience, act, react, and so on in the same ways that we do. And so it would actually require a multiplication of kinds of entities to say, well, there's one kind of entity that presents this way and affects the envelope in this way and has subjective experience, and one that affects the envelope and presents to the envelope in the same way, but actually doesn't have subjective experience. That actually requires more of a multiplication of entities, more assumptions, more dividing lines to be made. And so that would actually be the thing that requires reasons to conclude. Whereas the simpler explanation is that all these expressions that are tied to our own subjectivity are, when we see them expressed in other places, tied to their subjective experience. Of course, this is not a foolproof, apodictically certain knowledge. It is based on a correlation and essentially an application of Occam's razor. However, as I talked about in the previous section, that is really the extent to our ability to understand anything about the envelope anyway. So we can essentially be just as certain of the existence of other minds as we can be certain of really anything about the external world. Especially since the belief that other minds have subjectivity actually produces predictions about how they will act and react to us and be able to tell us new things about the world that we didn't know and sometimes couldn't even possibly have known, but which we can check later. And all of those predictions are borne out. And so we have to, in the interest of being able to function, we have to act at least as if these other beings have subjective experience. And now this actually includes animals, because animals present to the envelope in their, physical structures in all the same ways that we associate with having a subjective experience of pleasure and pain. And they act in all the ways we'd expect from a being like ourselves that experiences pleasure and pain. However, they don't act and present in the ways that we would expect from a being that is capable of, abstract thought and rational thought. And so it requires no new division to assume that they don't have those things, because we would not be creating a new type of entity with the same manifestation. We would instead be labeling a new manifestation, and in fact attempting to treat animals as if they had the rational thoughts or capacity for rational thought that humans have, like in the Nim-Chimpsky experiment, actually leads to failure, meaning we cannot, for the most part, act as if animals are as conscious as humans. And the problem of other minds, so adding subjectivity to the thing is something that requires some sort of reason. And adding consciousness also requires a reason. And in the absence of even the outward evidence of consciousness in animals, then we don't have a reason, even a reason based in Occam's razor, to add consciousness in the rational human sense to them. Now, this brings me to the problem of hallucination. So, we do know, or do we, that our senses can be fooled about the true state of the envelope. This is difficult to understand because, in some sense, if we always hallucinated that something were true, with all of our senses all of the time, then it would be indistinguishable from being true. However, if it was only some of our senses, or some of the time, or only some of our senses some of the time, then the question becomes more complicated. And I think this is where we need to resort to direct pragmatism once again. So, to return to direct pragmatism, where we care about the understanding the envelope because it influences our internal states, and we care about understanding that, and we can influence the envelope through action, and so the way in which we need to understand the envelope is through prediction. If most of our senses say one thing and only a few say something else, or some of our and we can weight this based on how surely they tell us something as well, then in an individual case, we kind of have to take that to be true in order to preserve the integrity of our good internal states. And so, if we are in a situation where something appears to be true and we feel it, we see it, we touch it, taste it, smell it, all of it, right? Then, and it seems truly real to us, then in an individual case, we must deal with it as if it were real because it has more weight on our experience than whatever few senses perhaps dispute it, right? So, for instance, if I feel someone stabbing me but don't see it, or something like that, the feeling is very strong, and it weighs out equally with, and it's one sense versus one sense, but the extremity of the feeling is much more, and so I'll turn around to see who is stabbing me, or something, right? However, we have to also take into account past and future experiences as well as present. So if most of the past indicates that reality is like one thing, then even if our current experience is telling us reality may be like something else, we should attempt to integrate our current experience into our system of understanding based on the weight of the previous past experiences that we've had. We want to do this because we should assume that the past will be very much like the future, and the future very much like the past, and the present like both of them. And so if the past was like something, and we see something that is outside of our past experience, but our understanding of the principles by which our past experiences operated, which allowed us to act and generate good past experiences, allowed of an experience like this new out-of-the-ordinary one, then we should attempt to interpret this out-of-the-ordinary experience in terms of those principles, instead of switching to entirely new principles, even if those entirely new principles might seem to more tightly mirror this specific out-of-the-ordinary experience. So let me give you an example. If I were to have a hallucination that, for a while, that I had the force, right, that I could, telekinetically levitate things, right? My understanding of the principles by which my past operate indicate to me that hallucinations are a possible thing that can happen. And in fact, in my own experience, I've had a number of hallucinations. So the principles by which I understood my past experiences in order to operate within them well and correctly admit of the possibility of me having this current experience without directly accepting a new principle contrary to my past experiences, which, although it may mirror more precisely my current experience, may not mirror more precisely all of my future experiences, because the future is more likely to be like the past, and the past was overwhelmingly operating by those previous principles. And so it would make more sense for me to assume that I'm having a hallucination than that I am developing new telekinetic powers. However, and now this goes into an understanding of the supernatural. If I were to, let's say I'm 19 years old right now, right? Let's say for the next 20 years I were to experience this telekinetic ability to levitate things. And for the purpose of this, we're assuming that I'm the only person that exists somehow, right? Then more of my past will actually have indicated that I have telekinetic powers, and that the principles of experience by which I can operate allow for telekinetic powers. Then my past will have demonstrated principles by which hallucination is possible, but not telekinetic powers. And so I would become more reasonable in assuming that I actually had telekinetic powers. And so in the cases of supernatural things, the supernatural could only truly be accepted if there was as much evidence and as common evidence and evidence that is actionable in the same way as for the natural, as much or more. Now, this is where we can bring in what I discussed with the problem of other minds. If I am having a certain experience, and the input that others give me tells me that that's not real, the principles of my past experience indicate to me that other people are often correct in their assessment of the immediate experiential reality around them, at least, and that it is unlikely that everyone around me is hallucinating instead of me being hallucinating, because hallucinating has a certain probability of happening that is below 1. And so for each person that were to be hallucinating, the property would go down proportionally. And so assuming that I was hallucinating, according to the principles of my past experiences, is more likely than assuming everyone else is. And so by these two principles, both the possibility of them being mistaken and the often demonstrated fact that other people are right in their immediate experiential understanding, and in the basic principles by which they can understand their experience, at least, I should conclude that if I'm seeing something very much out of the ordinary, but others in the room aren't, and are providing, input that they aren't, then I should more reasonably conclude, if I want to understand my reality, that I am not, in fact, experiencing this thing. Additionally, often hallucinations are only visual, and that makes things easier. And there are other things like this. We usually can't act on our hallucinations in the way we can on something that is truly real in the enveloping sense that the normal experiential world is. And this is actually where we come to the problem of authority. And that problem is, if I'm the only human whose experiences and knowledge I have access to, why should I trust the input of these other minds telling me about reality? And the answer is that I should trust them only so far as they, or others like them in important ways, have demonstrated the ability to be repeatedly, actionably correct about the reality that they are informing me of. So a doctor is very often correct about how to fix my illnesses. And so my past experience indicates that most of the time they're correct. And so I should have believe with higher certainty, because there's a higher probability that in the future they will also be correct. And this actually brings me to Bayesian reasoning. Because essentially what Bayesian reasoning is saying is that there is a certain percentage of my past that admits of a certain principle. And based on that principle, there is a certain percentage chance that the current experience I'm having now would occur. And then there may be other principles that are based on less experiences of my past. And by experiences of my past, I'm including authorities now. And they too have predicted certain probabilities of this certain new event happening. And so I can look and I can say, essentially, whether the overwhelming evidence of my past actually outweighs or does not outweigh how out of line with my principles, with the principles that describe the overwhelming majority of my past, outweighs the unlikelihood of the event that I'm seeing. And so basically what this means is that this is a sort of simple way of trying to figure out how likely a certain set of principles is to be correct given a new piece of data. Essentially based on trying to describe as much of my experience as possible based on the principles that are most applicable as well. And so in an attempt to help me select principles that are the most capable of explaining and especially predicting my experiences so that I can act properly. And this is where the idea of degrees of certainty becomes very important, because any set of principles that we derive from our experiences of the envelope are necessarily only probabilistically true. They describe a certain percentage of our past experiences, usually not all of them. And so the past will be like the future, and so a certain percentage of the past, attests to a certain principle. And so we can expect that a certain percentage of the future will attest to a certain principle. And so when you turn a percentage into a single event, you get a probability. So if my past, let's talk about bags of marbles. If I have one bag of marbles that's 3 green and 2 red, and then I have another bag of marbles, which I assume is the same, so 3 green and 2 red, then 60% of my the other marbles are green. And so if I pick out a marble of the other bag, I can predict that there's a 60% chance that it'll be green. And all that means is that if I pick them all out, 60% of them will be green, or 3 out of 5. And so, yeah, these are just a couple applications, a couple extensions of how experientialism works in practice. I hope this helps illustrate what I'm talking about.